Last week we started to take a brief look at the Gospels and their purpose for each one. And we made it through the first few. We didn't quite get to John. Does anybody remember the audience that Matthew was primarily writing to? The Jews, that's right. And Mark would have been more to a Roman audience. And then Luke had more of a Gentile or Greek audience. And before we get into John, however, I wanted to take a brief look at genealogies. And we see in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 accounts of the genealogy of Christ. Mark did not really spend any time on this. He spoke about Jesus as a man of action. Remember that immediately or straight away, as some versions would have it, or was a very common word in the Gospel of Mark. And in John, and we'll see in a minute, John did not really try to portray the beginning or the genealogy of Christ either. He focused more on the latter part of his ministry. And so there are a couple of things that we can glean from the accounts of Matthew and Luke with respect to Jesus' genealogy. Did anyone by chance have a chance to read those? Okay. Did anything stand out to you between the two, whether you're comparing them or contrasting them? Did any similarities or differences show? You don't?
I'm not going to say what I'm going to say because it's probably going to mess your lesson up.
I'll give you one strike.
Well, I think the Matthew is the genealogy of Joseph, and the other one is the genealogy of Mary.
Excellent point, Jill. So what Jill just said is that Matthew gave a genealogical account of Jesus through Joseph, whereas Luke focused more on the genealogy through Mary. And so that is indeed one of the points I want to make. Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, he was giving more of a legal genealogy of Jesus. And I think let's take a read of it so we can it'll be Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. And I'm reading from King James, so you're going to see some of the names in there. For example, in verse 8, you'll see Ozias, and that's how I would pronounce it, or Ozias in verse 8. That's Uzziah in most other versions. So you will hear some differences in the names, but rest assured it's just a translation thing between King James and your version. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. And Judas begat Phares and Zerah of Tamar, and Phares begat Ezram, and Ezram begat Aram. And Aram begat Amminadab, and Amminadab begat Nason, and Nason begat Salmon. And Salmon begat Booz of Rechab, and Booz begat Obed of Ruth, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David the king. And David the king begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Urias. And Solomon begat Rehoboam, and Rehoboam begat Abiah, and Abiah begat Asa. And Asa begat Josaphat, and Josaphat begat Joram, and Joram begat Ozias. And Ozias begat Joatham, and Joatham begat Achaz, and Achaz begat Ezekias. And Ezekias begat Manassas, and Manassas begat Amon, and Amon begat Josias. And Josias begat Jeconias and his brethren about the time they were carried away to Babylon. And after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begat Salathiel, and Salathiel begat Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel begat Abiud, and Abiud begat Eliakim, and Eliakim begat Azor, and Azor begat Sadok, and Sadok begat Achim, and Achim begat Eliud. And Eliud begat Eleazar, and Eleazar begat Mathan, and Mathan begat Jacob. And Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. Verse 17, the way it ends, speaks to these 14 generations. And Matthew goes back to Abraham. Abraham being generally considered as a father to the Jews, legally would have been very important to be able to trace the lineage to Abraham for the Jewish people. Matthew takes an artistic approach of listing the genealogy. He gives 14 generations from Abraham to David, and you can count those. I'll put a tick by every name, counted them up. It really is 14. And then, and you see that in verse 6 here, where Jesse begat David. So that's your 14th. And then from there, down into verse 11, you've got another 14, about the time that they were carried away into Babylon. So that would have been their dispersion, their exile. And then from that time of exile unto Christ was another 14 generations. And we're not going to do this morning, we don't have time for it, but if you were to compare the genealogy of Christ in Matthew as in Luke, you are going to see some differences. So, for example, in verse 8, we see Matthew calls Joram the father of Ozias. But he actually skipped 3 generations there. And that was purposely done. I don't know if you remember the time, the 3 generations he skipped was Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. And they were all caught up in a very tumultuous time, among which there was also a queen, Athaliah, who ruled for about 6 years. And there was a lot of evil that was done in the sight of the Lord at that time. And they were basically omitted on purpose from history.
Hey, Glenn.
Yes, Jill?
Just something that I didn't understand before I'm learning as a Christian is why these genealogies were so important. Because didn't they have to trace it back to Abraham to prove that their genealogy is a Jewish person?
Yes, so the Jews would have never accepted Jesus if he wasn't a Jew.
Right.
So they had to prove that he was Jewish, but he also has an emphasis on the royal aspect of Jesus' inheritance as king.
Right.
So he traces him through David, the king, who is also a major figure for the Jewish people, but continues further back to Abraham, who is also the father of the Jews. So this gave to a Jew, this would have been this is like legal proof that Jesus is legitimate.
Right.
And so this is a proof to the Jews at the time. And so it was really, that's the importance of it. That's why it's listed that way. They would not have accepted Jesus if he did not have a royal connection to their ancestors.
The promise that was made to David.
Well, there are the many prophecies too.
Yeah, and see, that helped me a lot to because I used to think, what in the world is all this in here for, all these genealogies? But that helped me to understand why. It helped me to understand why.
It's very much a legal description. It would have been something that a Jewish person of that time would like, okay, this is legal proof. Jesus was a Jew, and we can trace him all the way back through David, and of which the prophecies would have did speak of, and so they would have known that and been familiar with those scriptures. This would have been very legitimate proof that Jesus came from that lineage. And it was a royal, that of a royal lineage. So and that did trace back through Joseph. But note in verse 16, he includes Joseph, but how does he describe Joseph in verse 16? The husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. It doesn't say that he was his genetic offspring, and mentions a woman, which is rather uncommon when you're giving legal descriptions like this. This would have been uncommon for the day. They typically omitted the names of women. However, there are other women that are mentioned. So, in fact, a total of 4 women were mentioned if you include Mary. The others are Tamar, Rahab, and Bathsheba.
And Ruth is Ruth.
And Ruth as well. And you can see those back up here in, we've got Rahab in verse 5. We've got Ruth in verse 5. We've got Bathsheba in verse 6. And Tamar, you see her in verse 3. And it's interesting to note that 3 of these women, not Ruth, the other 3, had a tarnished history. They, mostly with lascivious type or sexual type of immorality associated with them. If you were to look up Tamar, you can read about her in Genesis chapter 38. How she was the daughter-in-law of Judah. And you can read, obviously, about Rahab, I believe, was a Canaanite. And then some of you might have Rahab, perhaps in your versions. And we all know about her and how the spies came into Jericho, the Israelite spies came in and they stayed with her, and she lied to protect them. And then, of course, Ruth, she was Moabite. So it's interesting that in Jesus' genealogy, we've got 5 women mentioned. That in and of itself is very uncommon. And several of them that weren't even Israelite, and perhaps all of them were not Israelite.
So they're
and several of them had moral issues. Isn't that interesting how Matthew on the very onset includes this? Remember, we have had discussions in the past about how Jesus breaks barriers, how he breaks through traditions. In the very beginning of Matthew, we're seeing it. We see that despite him not necessarily being genetically pure in a sense, although you do see an absolute connection to the royal descent that Jesus had, we see the royal ancestors. But despite that, and despite imperfect people, every one of these people were imperfect, but even the women were mentioned, several of them had some serious issues too. Is that not almost like the perfect way of Jesus being able to come and relate to people? To be able to ensure salvation for all who have sinned? It's quite significant. And in the same way, the fact that he mentions women at all, in that same way elevates women in a way that probably wasn't generally thought of in the day. Women are equal to men in the sight of God. And so this is something you will not see elsewhere, whether it be another religion or other historical documents of the day. This is a very unique type of thing to see. And so I think there's more than one aspect to Matthew mentioning women in the very beginning. He's breaking through barriers before Before we even see, in the very first part of our compilation of the New Testament, we see Jesus breaking barriers. And it was designed that way from the beginning. Which, is it maybe Jesus' way of waking the people up to the way God had originally designed things? Well, let's take a quick look at Luke chapter 3. We won't go in quite as much detail here. But Luke chapter 3, we see from verses 23 through 38 another genealogy. And we won't read through all of this. But one thing that Luke does very differently is he goes backwards. So Matthew started from Abraham and worked forward to Jesus in real time. Luke goes the other way. He starts from Jesus, noting him being about 30 years of age in verse 23. And we have discussed that already with respect to when he started his ministry. The son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. And then he works all the way back. How far did Luke work back? All the way to Adam, which was the Son of God. So he's the Son of God, the Son of God. But Luke, remember his audience? His audience was more of a Greek, Gentile audience. It was an audience that needed to understand that Jesus originated from the beginning. That Jesus really did come from God. And so it reaches that broader audience that he's looking toward. It's not written in the same legal, royal aspect that Matthew did. Although a lot of those characters are still mentioned. Now there are a number of expositors who have suggested that Luke, as well as Matthew, traced the genealogy just through Joseph. But let's take another look at verse 23. There are some notable scholars who have said exactly what Jill noted, that Luke does indeed go back through Mary's lineage. It says the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. If you were to go through the Jewish Talmud, now the Talmud is basically a collection of ceremonial laws and traditions and lore, if you will. It's not Holy Scripture, it's a compilation of Jewish writings and their stories and their traditions. It's very clear that Heli was the father of Mary. So they mention Joseph, but then they say the son. But then he says the son of Heli, which was Mary's father.
In my translation, it says being supposedly the son of Joseph in verse 23.
Right. In society at that time, everybody looking at the family unit would see Jesus, the son of Joseph. And so when you see that in parentheses in verse 23, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, that's what that's referring to. But then he further clarifies, which was the son of Heli. And so there are other scholars that take the approach that, well, because of this now, we are tracing back through Mary's lineage. And there are some crossovers if you were to examine it closely. But Luke, again, is still appealing to a more Gentile or Greek audience. Matthew was focused on that royal descent, and so stuck with the line of Joseph, sorry. So there's one, that's another main difference. So those are the main 2 points I wanted to make. You could go through and study this out into much more depth. But just note that the genealogies are not in conflict with each other. They are listed the way they are for the audience that it was being targeted at the time, and both are actually true. You're just looking at two lineages. But interesting to note that both are verified and verifiable. The other thing I guess there'd be one more thing I would say about Luke chapter 3. He traces the genealogy all the way back to Adam, the Son of God. That is in direct opposition to evolution and evolutionary thought. Okay? And if you are to accept evolution and the idea that life on Earth evolved over millions and billions of years, yet we have a genealogy here that's written very much in a historical way, just a matter of fact, that traces straight back to Adam. There's no way that that could equal to millions or billions of years. So when people are trying to reconcile maybe an affection for the thought of evolution versus trying to get to know God a little bit, this is an important thing to study and to look at. Because if the scriptures are indeed true, what do you do when you accept evolution? Basically, this, among most of the rest of the Bible, is going to be rendered false. And how can you believe in something in which part of it's false? So we have a choice to make. And I, for one, would not degrade the power and abilities of God over the cleverness of humankind. All right, are there any other comments before we move to the Gospel of John? John, he had perhaps similar to Luke, a more cosmopolitan approach to Jesus in his account, in the sense that he was reaching out to all in the world, not just a particular demographic. He wrote, in essence, to prove Jesus' deity. He's been referred to, that gospel has been referred to as the selective gospel, because John chose about 7 signs before his death, affirming many more were done, but that the selected were enough. Let's take a quick look at John chapter 20. And it'd be John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. And if anyone's got that, go ahead and read it.
Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
That is why John wrote the Gospel of John. That we might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing we might have life through his name. John avoids repetition in his Gospel. However, he does provide extra information in the accounts that he gives. We did a study last winter about Joseph of Arimathea and we talked about the burial of Jesus. We can see, for example, and this is just one example, John chapter 19, I believe, describes a lot of this. John gives a lot of detail in there that the other Gospels don't give. In fact, about 92% of John's account is unique to John. He gives a lot of detail. John provides an emphasis on Jesus' ministry, on his Jerusalem ministry and controversies that he had with Jewish leaders of the time. And so a lot of that discourse that happened, John really highlights this. Chapters 12 through 20. So we're looking about half of the Gospel of John. Chapters 12 through 20 just includes the last week before his crucifixion, before Jesus' crucifixion. Chapters 12 through 20, focusing on just that last week. The other Gospels don't do this. Chapters 6 through 21, if you were to expand that a little bit from 12 to 20, go from 6 to 21, that covers about the last year of Jesus' life. And so that's about 76% of the Gospel of John right there, just covering that within the last year. In fact, remember we talked about how long Jesus' ministry was likely? Probably about 3 to 3.5 years or so. Of that part of his ministry, John covers just a little bit more than a month of that. He really focused on that last bit. And why? Because it proves his deity. It proves his salvation opportunity to us. So he depicted the person and the work of Jesus in a way that we can interpret deep meaning from. And so that concludes just the brief summary of the Gospels, just to give you an idea, a little bit of context as we go further into the study. Yes, Dan?
Well, you think about it, we just went through, Matthew goes back to Abraham, Luke goes back to Adam,
Mm-hmm.
beginning of John starts him with God.
That's a good point, Dan.
That's a part of, so he
Yes.
fills in that last blank.
Yeah, even before.
Even before.
Even before the world was made. He goes back even further
That's
to...
kind of awesome if you think about it.
It's kind of a crescendo, right?
Yeah, it does.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. John indeed does give more detail even to the origin.
Yeah.
The Word was with God. And we will talk about that Word in a little bit. We only have a few minutes remaining. Next week we're going to look at the deity of Jesus. And again, the life of Christ, as we're discussing, it typically covers the time he spent on earth, as we see accounted for in the 4 Gospels. His eternal nature should also be considered. We cannot do a study of Jesus' life without considering his eternal nature. So we're going to examine his deity. We're going to talk about the titles given to Jesus. We're going to get into a little bit on the messianic prophecies. Then his pre-existence, his incarnation, as well as the virgin birth. And so that's going to take up a few more weeks. I really don't have enough time to get started on that, but next week we will start in talking about the deity of Christ and the scriptures that go along to discuss that. And I suspect that when we get to some of the titles of Christ, I know the women have been studying this at times, so I'm not going to cover every title, but if you do have any comments on other titles, I'd be open to hear those comments. So with that, we'll conclude for this morning, and thank you for your attention.